Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey. Today we'll be discussing Game 21 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Ottawa Senators, in which the Sharks have won 5-1. So the Sharks came into tonight's game in a very close, contentious matchup here against the Ottawa Senators for that second to last place spot in the entire National Hockey League. The Sharks currently found themselves just barely behind them in the standings by a few percentage points in the points percentage race, and so the Sharks managing to get this win will actually surpass Ottawa in that. For those who are obviously hoping for the Sharks to be losing these games and to be tanking this season, this is going to be a pretty disappointing win for the Sharks, because by the end of the year, when it comes down to the wire and both the Sharks and the Senators find themselves near the bottom of the standings, potentially at least for the San Jose Sharks, this could be looked back on as a 4-point game that potentially swung it one way or the other, and so going to be a pretty disappointing win. But for those who are actually hoping for the Sharks to have some success this season, this is going to be a nice return to form for San Jose. After a very disappointing outing in the previous game against the New York Rangers, the Sharks respond rather well here against the Ottawa Senators, but it didn't start off all that well. In the first period, the Sharks got absolutely pummeled, just as equally pummeled as they had gotten in the third period against the Rangers, so it kind of carried over. Interestingly enough, however, even though the Sharks were getting absolutely destroyed in the opening frame, they actually scored the first goal of this game. That one came from Noah Gregor, who played his first game in a while, and this also ended up actually being the long-standing shot for the San Jose Sharks. This goal by Gregor was the only shot the Sharks had in the first 12 minutes of this game, until a Timo Meier shot from relatively far out actually gives them their second one. And so this was a first period dominated by the Senators, and while they would end up getting a goal to tie this one up, their only goal of the entire game, the fact that the Sharks weren't down multiple goals here in this first period was definitely a miracle in itself. In the second period, the Sharks really did respond, and it started off quite early. A Timo Meier 9th goal of the season would make it 2-1 about a minute and a half in, and then the Sharks took control. The Senators honestly couldn't get too much established in the second period, besides a couple chances here or there. Nieto would add one very soon after to make it 3-1. Eventually, a Tomas Hertl power play goal would make it 4-1, and not necessarily putting the game away. Obviously, a comeback was possible, but the Sharks were firmly in the driver's seat going into the third period, where the Senators definitely brought it back. There was some score effects going on where the Senators seemed to control the pace of the third period, mostly because they were the team that was trailing, and so the Sharks have zero onus into actually pushing the pace and taking any risks and things like that, the usual case. But the fact that the Sharks kept the Senators off the board in that third period was very impressive, and they eventually got an empty netter from Logan Couture to take it 5-1. Now, before going into the players to talk about, there is one thing, or maybe two things, that I actually want to talk about here when it comes to the San Jose Sharks, and that is their special teams list. So let's first start off with the power play here. The power play really struggled right out the gate for the San Jose Sharks. A few games where they just really couldn't get anything going, and the big thing with the Sharks power play was that, yes, their first power play unit was quite solid, very good in fact, with Carlson and Meier and Couture and Hertl and Barabanov. The second power play unit was probably one of the worst power play units in the entire league, which featured players like Cunnin, Bonino, Nico Sturm, Kevin Labanc, Mario Ferraro. Matt Benning was trialed in this situation at some point. I mean, this is just generally not any player who would even necessarily be much more than the third liner. Labanc, the only one who could be regarded as a power play specialist, but that type of power play specialist that Labanc is usually wants to have other very good players with him, which he's not really in the case. So the second power play unit was definitely something that was, kind of suspect coming into the season. But the Sharks, what they have done, especially recently, have employed what I like to call the Washington Capitals strategy, which is that they basically just say, hey, you know what? We have one good power play unit. Why don't we just play them pretty much the entire time? And that's exactly what they have been doing. It feels like pretty much every Sharks power play, they get a good minute and a half. I would say sometimes there are situations where the puck gets cleared at the minute and 10-second mark, and so you kind of just go for a change at that point, and the second power play unit does come on, and then if there's another whistle, maybe the first power play unit comes back on. But usually they're going to be playing a good minute to 90 seconds, and potentially even the full power play. Erik Karlsson in particular on the back end very frequently plays the entirety of the power play unless he had just had a shift prior to this penalty called. And so just doing this has actually worked in the favor of the San Jose Sharks to be significantly better on the power play as of late. Coming into tonight's game, they were 19.2%, which isn't the most impressive number, but adding a power play goal here tonight, and if you remove those first absolute struggles of a game, those first 5 games of the season where the Sharks just looked awful in general, the power play has actually been much better. But the major special team to talk about does have to be the penalty kill, which is now, it actually was coming into today, the first in the league by a pretty wide margin at 92.5%. Now, you do frequently see very high penalty killing percentages early on in the season, but usually that early on is like 5 games, maybe 10 games. We're now 20 games into the season, now 21 games into the season, and the Sharks' penalty killing percentage is still incredibly impressive. I would imagine with the fact that the Sharks gave up a few power plays here tonight and didn't give up a goal, it may very well come very close to hitting the 93% mark, which is just absolutely absurd. The New Jersey Devils currently hold the record for the league's best penalty kill ever, all the way back in the 11-12 season, where, by the way, they made it to the Stanley Cup Finals with a mark just under the 90% situation. Even though 21 games is still a decent sample size, obviously we're 61 games away from the end of the season. Anything can happen. The Sharks could go on a stretch of 5 games where they give up 5 power play goals, and suddenly that's the end of that. But the fact that not only do they sit, at least coming into this game, 31st place in the league, but that they still managed to have a number 1 penalty kill is kind of crazy, and it's just an absolutely mind-blowing stat. And it's not even the first time this has happened. The Sharks, over these past couple of years, while they have been missing the playoffs and being a bad team, their penalty kill has remained top 5 pretty much throughout those seasons. So I don't exactly know why that is the case, how that is the case, but it certainly is impressive to have kept up over multiple different coaches. Moving on to the players to talk about, we have Hertl, Meyer, and LeBanc on the first line. Definitely a nice bounce-back game from the previous one. Maybe not reaching the same level of dominance as we had seen in that winning streak that the Sharks had going, but definitely still very, very good here tonight. Timo Meyer in particular setting up a lot of very nice plays for himself. He's just weaving and whipping into the zone. There was this play later in the third period, maybe 5 minutes left, where he kind of dipped and dangled, almost got a very good chance off. Kind of looked like he got tripped, though there was no call on the play, and just Timo Meyer has really looked like his old self from just last season after a pretty rough start. But the good thing about that is that last season Timo Meyer was pretty much a one-man show with the help of Tomas Hertl for sure on the other side. But now not only does he still have Tomas Hertl there as his centerman on the line, but the big thing is that he also has Erik Karlsson on the back end backing him up. Last year it was Brent Burns and Erik Karlsson, but neither of them were necessarily just like that elite offensive defenseman anymore. They were getting some good points, they were dishing out some decent passes, they were having some very good games occasionally, but nothing super consistent. But with Erik Karlsson's absolute resurgence this season to being the best offensive defenseman in the NHL currently, Timo Meyer is hugely benefiting from that. So the 9 goals he currently has puts him on pace for about 36-ish throughout the entire year, 35-36 goals. But it should be reminded that this is now, if you take out that rough start, 9 goals in his last 12 games, which is a significantly higher goals per game pace. So it'll be very interesting to see exactly where Timo Meyer lands. With very little goal support last year, he managed about 76 points, I believe. With the support of Erik Karlsson on the back end now, if that lasts for an entire season, as long as Karlsson doesn't get injured or even somehow traded, it's possible Meyer could easily eclipse that point per game mark and maybe even further. On the second line, not necessarily the most impressive game for the second line. Barabanov, Couture, Nieto not necessarily doing a ton in the offensive zone, but I do want to have a quick mention for Logan Couture, who I thought continues to showcase some solid defensive play like he has been showing over these past few games. I really saw some strong effort from him. Late in the third period, he was interrupting passes on the power play. He was going for aggressive back checks while the Sharks were on the power play to try and get back shorthanded to prevent even a goal that would just make it 4-2, which wouldn't necessarily be like the tying goal, but still, Couture is putting in the effort to do that. He gets the 200-foot empty net goal. Couture, that's his 10th of the season, by the way. Like I mentioned in the previous game, he is managing to keep up offensively, even if necessarily his start of the season wasn't that great. So it's nice to see that the captain has managed to find ways to get into it, at least as of late. On to the third line, we saw the absence of Nico Sturm here tonight because, it's a bit odd. He took that big hit from Ryan Carpenter at the end of the first period. He then came back to play the second and played the rest of the game. In fact, 17 minutes of ice time in that particular one, which is pretty good. But then he ends up being a pretty late scratch for this game here tonight. Gregor draws in his place. Bonino moves to the center on that line, and it had been 2 games straight in which the third line had actually looked pretty good, and that kind of continues here tonight. Obviously, Noah Gregor, while he wasn't necessarily super apparent besides this one shift obviously stands out as a massive positive. Not only does he get this goal, but even prior to that, he came very close to scoring a goal, which was the breakaway where he ends up hitting, I believe, the crossbar, and then a few seconds later leads to this very impressive and skillful goal. So that was nice to see from Gregor. I thought Cunnin actually had a pretty good game, which is very surprising because he very rarely has those types of games. And Bonino also not too bad. So it's nice to see finally the third line is actually showing up and being pretty good. And now it has been 3 games, so maybe this is actually some sort of pattern for the Sharks. Meanwhile, the fourth line, which has been very bad over these past few games, and I talked about potential changes that could be made, and the Sharks did indeed make a substitution. The Sturm one seemed relatively forced to be putting in Noah Gregor, but the Svechnikov one is not. That's a healthy scratch. Gadjevich draws into the lineup, and the fourth line was no better. There was this one shift where Gadjevich, I think, had like a chance, but that was probably like the only good chance for this fourth line throughout the entirety of the game. So once again, they are pretty much dead weight. And let's move on to the defensemen. I do want to mention Erik Karlsson here. 30 points now on the season, a very, very quick 30 points for himself in just 21 games as a defenseman. Currently finds himself 3rd in the league in terms of scoring, generally, not just in terms of defensemen. But I would just want to mention sort of the absurdity of what he is doing this year. He had 2 assists here tonight, and the broadcast actually showed a graphic of that. Oh, he has 6 shots, he has 2 assists. And my first reaction to that wasn't like, wow, impressive, great night for him for 2 assists. It was mostly just a, yeah, 2 assists, that's whatever, which is insane because when you look at like most players, if they had showed a graphic of Noah Gregor having a goal and an assist, he didn't have that tonight, by the way, but if they had shown that, or maybe a better example would be to show a graphic of Luke Cunnin having 2 assists, I'd be like, wow, what a great game for Luke Cunnin, 2 assists, very impressive. But Karlsson has been so good this season and so effective offensively that seeing 2 assists is more like the baseline minimum of what I am expecting from Erik Karlsson. Is that fair to him? Not really. Expecting 2 points a game from anybody is absolutely absurd. Even from the best player in the league, Connor McDavid, is not putting up 2 points in a particular, or in every single game on average. But it just has really felt that way as of late with Karlsson to a point where you're just not even surprised anymore. And finally, let's talk about the goaltending. Kähkönen draws back into between the pipes here for the San Jose Sharks. They gave him the slightly easier game here tonight against the Senators. Like I mentioned, the Senators right near the bottom of the standings where the San Jose Sharks also are. And Kähkönen, who has really struggled this year, definitely has a nice redemption game here tonight. Was very, very good in the first period. There was very, very early on in the first period, he almost gave this puck away right in front of the net to lead to the first goal of this game, and it could have been a completely different game at that point. But Kähkönen managed to recover from that, and then from that point onward was extremely solid. He kept the Sharks alive earlier on for them to then later support him with that goal support. So I was definitely very impressed with Kähkönen, and it'll be interesting to see who now gets the next start because Kähkönen's most recent game is a win. Reimer's is a loss. Even if Reimer's game was very impressive in that loss, we'll see what happens on Wednesday. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Wednesday, like I just said, and they'll be facing off against the Seattle Kraken. And the most interesting thing about that is not necessarily the history between these two teams, because of course the Kraken came into the league last year, so there really isn't any history. But there is history with the Kraken goaltender. They are currently riding Martin Jones, and you might think, if you're not really familiar with what the Seattle Kraken are doing this year, that is an awful situation for them, and they find themselves right at the bottom of the standings. You might be thinking, if the Sharks are 31st, the Kraken must be 32nd with Jones, but actually, he has been very good for Seattle, and the Kraken at the moment are in a playoff spot, are doing rather well, so it'll be interesting to see in that reunion how the Sharks do. Class dismissed.